Hello everyone, my name is Ted Glasser from the Department of Communication. I am the first tier moderator. It's a two-moderator program tonight. Gives me an opportunity to thank, above all else, the four people who made this program possible. Anita Varma and Christine Larson, two of our distinguished PhD students, and Pat and Roland Rebele, our benefactors who have contributed so much, not only to this program, but to the department in general. This is an incredibly important topic tonight, and I'm delighted to have such a superb panel join us. It's in many ways an old and familiar topic, but with a sense of urgency because it's so easy to be fooled into believing that the internet has solved our problems. The internet may indeed make more voices available and more choices available, but that's not really the issue. The issue, I think, is the amplification of those voices and the creation of the conditions for democratic participation, and there's little reason to believe that the internet has achieved that. I think the key question tonight is a question posed by the political theorist Iris Marion Young, who asked, what are the norms and conditions of inclusive democratic communication under circumstances of structural inequality and cultural difference? This is, I think, a provocative question, and I look forward to the panel's response to it. In the case of journalism, a concern for diversity, media diversity, press diversity goes back to at least the 1930s with the creation of the Federal Communications Commission, which was very concerned with diversity and its connection to community. Past that, it was the Kerner Commission in 1968, the Commission on Civil Disorder in the United States, which found that, and this is a quote from the Commission report, the press has too long basked in a white world, looking out of it, if at all, with white men's eyes and a white perspective. It called on the press, the Kerner Commission called on the press to begin the painful process of adjustment that would make a reality of integration in both their product and their personnel. It took the Association of the Society of Newspaper Editors nearly 10 years to decide what it wanted to do about this problem, but in 1978 it pledged, it promised to create racial and ethnic parity between newsrooms and the community the newsroom served by the year 2000. I figured it would take at least a quarter of a century through attrition and other measures to achieve their goal. The year 2000 comes along and they weren't even close. So what did ASNE do? They reconfigured the deadline to 2025. Given recent developments, it's unlikely that they're even going to be close in 2025. In the bad economic times that we all experienced a few years back with the decrease in the number of newsrooms, decrease in the size of newsrooms, the percentage of minorities in newsrooms have actually decreased, not even stayed stable. I think one of the issues that confronts us and prevents us from thinking creatively about the diversity question, the question of choice, the question of voice, has to do with a very limited understanding of what a free press means and what a free press exists for. This program is sponsored by the First Amendment Fellowship that Reb and Pat are sponsoring, and Christine is our resident fellow. So let me just say a concluding remark about what the First Amendment has to do with tonight's discussion from my perspective. There's a difference, I think, between protecting speakers and protecting speech, between protecting individual expression and protecting the content of expression. In the traditional view of the First Amendment, the view that most American journalists are wedded to, and I would argue the view that prevents them from thinking creatively about solutions to the problem of diversity. Freedom of the press is usually understood as protecting speakers, not speech, protecting individual expression, not the content of expression. And it brings to mind a very famous quote from an important First Amendment theorist who we seldom read anymore. This goes back to the late 1940s when Alexander Meiklejohn said that the purpose of the First Amendment is not to protect unregulated talkativeness. The purpose of the First Amendment is to be sure that everything worth saying gets said. With that, let me introduce you to the real moderator tonight, Christine Larson.
Hi, we'll try not to have any unregulated talkativeness tonight. It will be highly regulated. Thank you very much, Ted. As many of you in this room know, I was a journalist before coming back to grad school, and our industry has fallen on hard times. So as a freelance writer, I was looking around and I was thinking, oh, I need a job. I need a new field that offers job security and lots of money. And so I went to graduate school. Oops, yeah. Maybe not the right move, but it is the right move because this is the best time ever to study the transformation of media. And what is so exciting to me about the Rebele Symposium is you guys in this room, because this is an opportunity for practicing journalists, journalism students, and scholars of journalism to all come together and talk about the incredibly important changes that are taking place in our industry that affect everyone in our society. And yet often the practitioners and those who study journalism as scholars don't always get to come together. So this is a real privilege, and I thank not only our speakers, but you in this room tonight. And I ask you to continue the conversation after the symposium upstairs, where we'll have a nice reception. We think these are very important conversations. A few more thank yous. Ted, thank you very much for your guidance and thoughts on the importance of free speech. I want to thank my advisor, Fred Turner, and the Rebelees, of course, Mark Dizzotti, Mark Sauer, and the department office for all the logistics, and Anita Varma, not only for organizing and promoting this, but for contributing the crucial element of the title. This talk is called More Voices, More Choices, ? And that question mark is important, and Anita put it there, because there are so many questions left about whether or not we are actually seeing expanded opportunities for a wider diversity of ideas and voices. And we're going to answer some of those questions tonight with our distinguished speakers. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about the shape of this evening. We like to make the Rebele Symposium shaped like a martini glass. So we like to start with the big picture, the academic issues, the high-level thinking, and then we like to dig down and talk to the practitioners and the people on the ground who are working to make change. So we'll start with Catherine Squires from University of Minnesota, and then we'll hear from Ivan Sigal from Global Voices and Katie Orenstein. Let me tell you just a little bit about them. So Catherine Squires is the Cowles Professor of Journalism, Diversity, and Equality at the University of Minnesota. Her research focuses on media, race and politics, gender, and the public sphere. She is co-editor of The Obama Effect, Multidisciplinary Renderings of the 2008 Election. She is very well known for an article called Rethinking the Black Public Sphere, and she holds a PhD in Communication Studies from Northwestern University. She'll be our first speaker. After that, we'll hear from Ivan Sigal. He is Executive Director of Global Voices, which is an international community of writers, editors, and citizen journalists, over 1,300 people in more than 120 countries who are working to incorporate more non-Western voices in mass media, not just in the US, but all over the world. Previously, Ivan was a senior fellow at the US Institute of Peace, where he worked on the impact of communication technology and information access in conflict-prone areas. And he's designed and implemented dozens of media assistance projects. He's also worked on media and humanitarian projects in Sri Lanka, China, Central Asia, Afghanistan, many other locations. And finally, we'll hear from Katie Orenstein, founder and CEO of the OpEd Project, which is a social venture which aims to increase the range of voices and the quality of ideas that we hear in the world. Katie and her organization works with universities, with nonprofits, with corporations, with think tanks and groups all over the country to help underrepresented experts become part of the public conversation and become thought leaders. Katie's own writing has appeared in the op-ed pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Miami Herald, just to name a few spots. And she's also the author of Little Red Riding Hood Uncloaked, Sex, Morality, and the Evolution of a Fairy Tale. So with that, I thank you all very much. And Catherine, we will hear from you first.
So I'm a little bit sun-dazzled coming from Minnesota. So I apologize if I sort of space out a little bit. So I wanted to thank Anita and Christine for inviting me to be part of this symposium. It's a real honor to be here, and I hope that I am able to do the high-level thinking that has been asked of me. And I'd also like to thank Ted Glasser for mentioning Iris Marion Young, because you perfectly teed up what I'm going to talk about, which leans heavily on her thoughts about objectivity and diversity. So Christine and Anita asked me to address issues of inclusion, specifically inclusion of groups that have been marginalized in our mainstream media systems. So first I'm going to talk about what I mean when I say marginalized groups. And then I'm going to turn to a consideration of objectivity, which is a word that gets bounced around a lot when we talk about news media. But I'm going to use a definition of objectivity from Iris Marion Young. And then building on that definition of objectivity, I'll give an example from my own work on editorials and reporting on the subprime mortgage crisis to illustrate the importance of including people to get a more objective sense of what's going on with various issues or policies in our society. So the other day I was at a talk by Kimberly Crenshaw, the critical race theorist who's at UCLA and Columbia Law Schools. And she made an observation that was quite provocative and disturbing. She said that in legal discourse, particularly with the cases before the Supreme Court right now, and also in popular discourse, the notion that we are a post-racial society suggests there's an expiration date fast approaching for any conscious efforts to remedy racial exclusion and inequality. This expiration date acts as if Obama's election or the visible demographic shifts in the electorate after the last 40 years has meant that the end of racial exclusion is imminent. And this requires us to revisit what marginalization means and what inclusion is actually for. So too often when we talk about inclusion, people use the word diversity. And many of these discussions of diversity stop at the issue of representation or access. That is, once there's no longer a legal barrier to access, and we see a few diverse faces in places that used to refuse their entry, we are done with our job. This view of diversity leaves out all of the social justice issues that predicated the struggles to gain that access. And it also forgets the disparities in health, wealth, social capital, and political power that linger due to the institutional and cultural mechanisms that created the initial marginalization. So when a dominant group marginalizes other groups on the basis of difference, whether it's racial difference, gender difference, or so on, those differences continue to matter even after reforms slowly come into being. Marginalization means that a group has been defined as not important to the well-being of the polity. Marginalization means that the voices of that group, the interests of that group, are neither imagined nor consulted as part of the general interest. When the dominant group successfully ascribes a particular racial, gender, sexual, or other identity group as marginal, it takes a lot of time and explicit effort to transform the institutional practices and cultural habits that were part of the original marginalization. Those habits and practices have to be transformed over time in order for people to be on equal footing. So the news media, as Professor Glasser pointed out, is one such institution built on exclusions. And indeed, through discourse, has also reinforced the marginalization of specific groups over time and ignored their voices or dismissed them outright as irrelevant. So this institution needs reform, just as the decisions on voting rights cases recently suggested that the offices of various county commissioners and legislators need reform as they continue to violate voting rights law to make it hard for people of color and poor people to vote. We need to continue the process of repair and restitution. For just as those corrupt voting procedures keep people of color and poor people from expressing their political interests, inequalities in news media keep marginalized groups from participating fully in the expression of their interests in conversation with others in the marketplace of ideas. So, if we really do believe that we are a deliberative democracy and that we need a range of information and opinions to include everyone in the conversation, that we need to expose people to diverse content, then we can't just count on people trawling the web and finding all this wonderful information in perhaps obscure sites. And if we really do expect people to be web superstars to get the variety that they need, we're also letting off the hook those large media institutions that are using the public airwaves and other resources that are supposed to be fostering national awareness and conversations across groups. We're also forgetting that we need to converse with other people. We need to interact with and exchange with people in real time, since time can be of the essence. We need efficient ways for the polity as a whole to be part of a shared or at least overlapping set of conversations in order to make our decisions. If we believe we should trust journalists to some extent to pare down and focus that agenda, then we also need journalists to do a better job of diversifying the viewpoints and information they provide as they make those agenda-setting decisions. So to have a robust public discussion, we need to move beyond the kinds of incremental visibility of people of color, women, and gays and lesbian that we have today. And that is actually declining in terms of newsroom jobs, as Professor Glasser mentioned. First, diversity within groups matters as much as across groups. So just having one or two people present at the table from a particular group doesn't really help. While members of identity groups share many interests and experiences, their interests and approaches can diverge as well. Think about the splits over affirmative action, for example, in the African American community. So, you can have differences of opinion over policy, obviously, even if you share a racial or a gender identity, but that shared identity still can matter in very important ways, particularly in terms of shared experiences of discrimination and exclusion. Even Clarence Thomas draws upon this shared experience African Americans have with white supremacy, as millions of other African Americans do. If you missed it, in 2002, one of the few times Justice Thomas spoke from the bench, he interrupted an argument saying that Ku Klux Klan cross-burning should be protected free speech. Right. And he invoked the Klan's reign of terror and 100 years of lynching and noted that the symbolism of the burning cross was meant to threaten and intimidate a particular class of Americans, those people of African descent. So again, the shared history of marginalization matters in looking at an issue that some people would say should be looked at in a colorblind fashion. So our shared heritage, our experiences in our identifiable bodies matter. How we experience the world is due in part to how other people react to us, how other people define us and make assumptions about us. How we experience the world is affected by how institutions that don't expect people like you or me to act or not act. So we have to recognize that these kinds of interactions, these kinds of expectations, whether they're stereotypes or otherwise, still happen. All we have to do is look at recent statistics and lawsuits about the stop and frisk policy in New York, or mortgage redlining, to show how institutions, even when they've been targets for reform and regulation, take a long time to transform their practices of discrimination against marginalized groups. People who share marginalized identities often share an understanding of how those legacies of inequality might affect them in the present. As Iris Marion Young explained it, people come into the world where social groups are a given, and people treat one another partly on the basis of imputed group membership. Because so much about political conflict and social inequality turns on these relational group experiences, public policy must take account of and respond to such experiences rather than try to ignore, level, suppress, or transcend them. So what does this mean for including diverse voices? Why should we care? Is including diverse voices just a way to air people's grievances or have a protest? Well, maybe, but not always. And so here I'd like to talk about Young's conception of objectivity before I turn to the example from my own research on news about the housing bubble. So Iris Marion Young's definition of objectivity is not about impartiality. It's actually part of her critique of impartiality, and she recognizes the ways that claims of impartiality can mask power imbalances. She asks us to consider thinking about objectivity as a process rather than as a state of being or some sort of product of impartial judgment. She argues, quote, for a concept of objectivity as the product of the transformation that partial points of view undergo in an inclusive dialogue. Such a situated and interactive conception of objectivity can distinguish itself from subjectivism, by which she means a point of view that remains enclosed in its initial starting point and has not reflectively enlarged itself to take account of other points of view. So key in her definition is the engagement, acts of reflection and interaction within an inclusive speaking environment. There's a sense here that you will be transformed through discussion. Even if you don't end up agreeing with the viewpoints of other people, you will be transformed and understand in ways that you would not had you not engaged. So in my 2 pieces that I've published on news and the subprime mortgage crisis, I discuss the need to interject alternative frames and experiences into public discussion unfettered by the rules and procedures of traditional journalism with sort of 2 sides to every story, because there's certainly more than 2 sides to every story. Routine journalism steeped in dominant traditions doesn't usually make enough room for including marginalized voices, particularly those around race and, as Katie will talk about, gender. The deeply entrenched and intertwined discourses of race and class require us to deploy critical memories of the past, imagine new metaphors and associations, as well as uncover salient evidence to unhinge common sense assumptions that order dominant discourse. The back and forth balance, quote unquote, deployed in traditional reporting rarely allows space for such exploration. Therefore, I decided to look at editorial pages to see if they would be a more likely vehicle for extended reflective discussion of the type that Iris Marion Young suggests. James Edema discusses the ways in which editorials can be a space where counter discourses and reflexive moments can emerge to challenge status quo thinking. It's also a place where, people can get some writing for free, because I don't know many op-ed folks who get paid for every word that they write. It also doesn't cost much to print letters to the editor, so it's a space where new voices might emerge more readily than places elsewhere in the newspaper. So my case study of mainstream news commentary on the subprime mortgage crisis found the following. First, most of these discussions acted as if this was an allegedly race-neutral topic. It was just markets and consumers, good decisions, bad decisions. But in the midst of this, it produced discourses of blame that pathologized people of color and pathologized policies that were meant to remedy imbalances in financial markets. However, I did find that the editorial pages did supply some moments of self-reflexivity and even arguably a counter-discourse that troubled these dominant narratives that gave readers a chance, at least, to reconsider common-sense renderings of race, wealth production, and housing. So most of the editorials insisted that the crisis was the result of bad decisions by 2 sets of actors. First, ignorant borrowers, mostly borrowers of color who were implicated here, and shady mortgage lenders. For example, a Los Angeles Times editorial proclaimed that the subprime crisis was a function of a new pathology amongst people of color, financial illiteracy. Quote, this time around, we're limited by too many choices rather than too few. Financial illiteracy is the new redlining. Okay, so they talked about the redlining of the past before the civil rights era and said, well, now it's not about race, it's about financial illiteracy, effectively denying that racial discrimination was still occurring in the housing market. And this has been proven time and again that there have been some incredible studies about how people of color with the same credit profile, same kinds of financial status were steered towards bad loans more so than white Americans. Now, the progressive editorials, or the few progressive editorials that I found in the mainstream news, did 2 things. First, they revisited and retold the history of racial struggles to get equal housing and equal access to capital, emphasizing evidence from present and past studies about discrimination against people of color. In so doing, these writers re-educated readers about key policy measures and illustrated how the Bush administration's laissez-faire approach to civil rights law had exacerbated the housing crisis because there was not oversight when there was discrimination happening. So these pieces revealed how the free market was not operating in a colorblind manner and that there was actually deliberate misleading of consumers of color. Many progressive writers also offered examples of state and federal home loan programs that had better success rates than the free market. So this evidence against the stereotype of the unworthy, ignorant homebuyer of color was certainly welcome. But only in one op-ed piece did anyone question the terms of the overall debate. So columnist and economist Paul Krugman managed to question one of the bedrock assumptions of the subprime crisis, that homeownership itself is always a social good. His column questioned the way that majority frames of homeowning versus renting distorted our picture of housing. So he said, here's a question that's rarely asked, at least in Washington. Why should ever-increasing homeownership be a policy goal? The belief that you're nothing if you don't own a home is reflected in U.S. policy, because the IRS lets you deduct mortgage interest from your taxable income, but doesn't let you deduct rent. So here, Krugman takes apart the unspoken assumptions about renters and homeowners. Renters are allegedly not invested in their communities and don't take responsibility the way homeowners will. So he was the only writer that I found who actually took this assumption apart, which also has racial overtones to it, of course, because people of color are more likely to rent, and racial prejudices can become intertwined with the myths of home ownership versus renting. So my second study, I looked at news outlets online that serve communities of color, and I found that they were much more likely to deconstruct the idea of homeownership itself and talk about community in a much different way, and also go beyond that to discuss the ways in which communities were rallying around each other's homes to try to not only stop the foreclosure crisis, because many of the foreclosures were being done without oversight, but also to lobby against the banks, to protest, and to put forward ideas for fair housing remedies that had been long neglected in the Federal Housing Administration. So these pieces in the alternative press, places like colorlines.com and The Root, question the idea that only homeowners are invested in society. They reminded us that we're still citizens and should be able to live with dignity even if we don't own a house. So if we think about the diversity of opinions springing in part from a diversity of experiences, and we think of those experiences as being shaped in part by inter- and intra-group relations, then bringing in people from different social groups, as these online sites did, different ascribed and marginalized identity groups, this makes sense. We can't get this kind of reflexive objectivity that Young prescribes to evaluate pressing issues if we don't include the people who are stakeholders writ broadly in a meaningful way. We can't imagine a broad enough variety of solutions if we don't hear multiple perspectives on what has caused the problem and how we might do better. And I'll stop there because the timekeeper already gave me my 5-minute limit. And we'll hear from our other speakers.
Good evening. Thank you everybody for coming, and thank you Anita and Kristen for organizing this lovely event. I'm going to talk to you tonight about an organization that I'm very privileged to represent and support, called Global Voices. Global Voices is a community of individual writers, translators, and editors from all over the world who collectively analyze local language, blogospheres, citizen media, social media content, and amplify and translate and explain local conversations for global audiences. And we do this We've been doing this now for about 7 years, and we do it out of a kind of a curious organic growth process in terms of our organization. We started really as a research project that was based on a simple question as people started writing blogs and citizen media outside of institutional constructs of mass media. That is, there are individuals who were all over the world who were writing about their communities, but they were not necessarily synchronizing or organizing their information in any kind of consistent way. But there's a great deal of information that's available in the citizen media context. And the question really is about discovery. How do you find useful information if you don't have trust, if you don't have verification, if you don't have access to the right language, and how do you know who to follow? And so back in 2005, a group of people affiliated with Harvard Law School's Berkman Center for Internet and Society started putting together a project that became Global Voices, whereby 40 or 50 individuals who had individual skills and specific knowledge and language about different parts of the world started to aggregate their knowledge together, and that became Global Voices. Today we have this is a sample of our homepage. Today we cover stories from about 120 different countries, and we write and translate our content into more than 30 languages. That's done mostly on a volunteer basis with about 30 part-time writers and editors, and then everybody else is a volunteer. So that's a snapshot of what we do. In addition to the main website, which is focused on this translation and storytelling focus, we also have a rights advocacy aspect to our work, which is about protecting online freedom of speech, and a development aspect to our work, which is about explicitly supporting communities that are systematically underrepresented due to structural means, mostly in the developing world. And most of our content is coming out of the Global South. I'll talk a little bit more about that project, which is called Rising Voices, as we go on. So just another quick snapshot of what our network looks like right now. But this is what it really looks like. So how many of you have seen a data visualization of a social network before? Does this look familiar to all of you guys? Great. Sometimes this kind of thing is not familiar at all, and I have to spend more time describing it. But so this is an analytic map of the top 10,000 people who follow Global Voices on their blogs. And the way this map works is that the larger the ball, the more influential the individual is in the network. The color of the ball, of the circle, is equivalent to a set of topics or keywords or other algorithmic processes that allow people to self-affiliate. So this is not a predetermined set of categories. These categories are created out of people's self-affiliation, which is a key point that I'll return to. And then the location on the map is the relationship that community has to their neighbors on the map. So, for instance, U.S. politics and Middle East politics are very close together. The Arabic language community is quite far away from that in terms of the number of hops or the relational aspect that they have one to the other. The way this map is drawn is important because in terms of its self-generating categories, because it's the way that Global Voices actually writes all of our stories. Our editorial process is inverted from your standard mass media news outlet. We don't tell people what to write. We don't create categories that are required. We don't set news agendas. We ask our volunteers to write about the subjects that are important to them in their communities. And then we study and understand the results. And what that tells us is that we often see that conversations, the way that conversations are structured or the way that our stories are structured, deviates from the norm, from the mainstream mass media norm. One or two quick points about this map just to understand how it looks. Why, for instance, is Russian separate from the rest of the world? It's separate because mainly two reasons. The first is that the Russians tend to write mostly and only in Russian language, and there's not a lot of translation bridge. Whereas for many of these other regions, there's a lot of linguistic bridging from one language to another, and so it's simpler. The second reason is that there are technological choices that different communities make in the world about which social media platforms they'll use. Russians use platforms like LiveJournal and Vkontakte. And well, now they use Twitter, though 2 years ago they didn't. And this map was made 2 years ago. So this map today would look a little bit different. But still, the Russian communications conversations are mostly captured within platforms that mostly use Russian. And so it's a separate space. For each one of these groups, though, we could analyze why those distinctions exist. I only point out Russian because it is so obviously separate. Here's another data influence map that shows how the Global Voices community works. This is the Egypt Influence Network. It's a Twitter map that describes the most influential Twitter users during the Arab uprisings in Egypt in 2011. And it's Arabic on the right in red and English on the left in blue, and purple is translation. So many of the purple nodes in the middle of this map and so many of the larger nodes are Global Voices authors. Contrawise, many of the smaller nodes that exist off to the left in English are mainstream news media. And so when you want to understand how a conversation actually crosses, as opposed to a news article, actually crosses language, or actually crosses, or who has influence within that network, this is a great example of visualization of what that actually looks like in terms of daily practice. So these are, and this is a map that you can find online, and you can look at each one of these large nodes is an individual. The size of the node equals their equivalent influence in the network, the number of people who follow them, the number of people who retweet them, and so forth. We can talk about this in more detail later on if we have time. I'm going to move to a slightly different topic. This is our Rising Voices project, and this is just a snapshot of our latest grant proposal process. Rising Voices, as I said, is a project that focuses on finding and supporting organizations that are systematically not online for some kind of structural systematic reason. Over a 6-year period now, 6 years, really? Yeah, 6 years. Wow. 6-year period, we've supported about 40 organizations with micro grants. But as we've done that, we've had an annual application process. And this year, I'd say in the last 4 years, we've had over 3,000 applications for these relatively small awards. And what that has shown us is the diversity of voices and perspectives from around the world of people who have a desire, who have a goal to create an online storytelling community or some other platform for their voice, for their issue, for their language. And that's I think probably a fairly minor subset of the whole, because those people are actually people who have access to English language. And this year we were also able to translate Spanish for the contest, but in previous years it's been only English. So that is already a major step. This year we had about 880 applications. This is just a quick map, and this is a slightly more detailed map for Asia and Africa, where the many applications come from. If you go to our site, you could click on each one of these nodes and you could read their applications. And so if you want to know concretely, who is it that wants to tell stories and where are they from and what are their issues, this is a great sample representation of some of the many questions that people are concerned about. Just really quickly, I'll point to what I think is the dominant challenge for a lot of groups like this, and that is resources are certainly important, but telling stories and figuring out how to create community, a sustainable community of story, is actually the biggest challenge. Figuring out how to organize structurally your community and to say, we're going to write about this for a while, this is a particular issue, we're going to use it to develop a story arc, we're going to use this to drive a conversation forward, is a skill that is quite difficult to manage over time. Many of the groups that are most successful who have sustained themselves over a 4 or 5 year period have figured out a way to talk about an issue that is deeply important to their community, and has the right incentive structure. So it's not really about money, it's about matching the story to the people's issues and their interest. This is just the homepage of that project, and I want to point out just a couple issues here that you'll see. The top two are indigenous language communities in Latin America. In the last couple of years, a topic that's especially important to us has been indigenous languages that are significantly underrepresented online. So we have projects in Quechua, projects in Aymara. We're actually working with a project now in Powhatan, which is a Native American language in Virginia that's completely off the web, and the project is to try to revitalize it and to recreate it in an online space. So Global Voices, in addition to having its diversity of views around the world, also is potentially the most gender-neutral media organization in the history of media studies. And this is a study that just came out from MIT Media Lab that analyzed our content since the organization's inception, and found that we are 51% women in terms of the number of the articles written, and that is also true across almost every region of the world, with a small exception in Africa having to do with one author who was incredibly prolific that kind of broke the system. But basically, Global Voices has an unusual gender balance, and I know we're going to hear some more about that later. And I just wanted to point to a couple of ideas about why that is so. The first reason is that our organization has a strong gender balance at the very top. So it's not a matter of a sample or representation of one or two people. Our team is more than 50% women. Our entire editorial team is women at the executive and managerial level. The second reason is that we have an active encouragement for both men and women, but especially, for instance, in the Middle East, more articles are written by women than by men, and there's an active push on the part of many people to say, let's make sure that we have some balance. A third reason, I think, is something, and this is a little bit of speculation on my part, but our content, because it is not driven by a newsroom agenda, is actually based on people's own participation levels. And so there's not an overarching kind of editorial control telling us who can or can't participate. And in our case, that means that anybody who wants to can, and we have equal participation. What do you know? So I think that is that topic remains to be studied in more depth, and I think we'd probably love to do some survey work to see what people's responses are in that case. But I think that those three issues are really important. An agenda-setting issue at the top, in which the norms we expect our community to be balanced and equal, and this other question of who actually can speak when there isn't an editorial control telling you, assigning stories or asserting that right from above. I'm going to talk to you. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes. Awesome. Great. So one more example, I think, of the way that Global Voices is different from a mainstream media outlet. Our content was especially prominent around the Arab uprisings, and many of the people in our community are also digital activists and had played a fairly significant role, especially in Tunisia and Egypt, in helping to break the censorship and surveillance regimes of those countries, and played a very significant amplification role, as I think I showed you with the brief example of that Twitter map of Egypt. So a couple of academics from the University of Texas last year did a study of New York Times, Global Voices, and Nicholas Kristof's Twitter feed. And they looked at the content from those three sources over a period of time in January and February 2011. in the context of what's known as the protest paradigm. The protest paradigm is a phenomenon, a media studies phenomenon whereby mainstream media have a tendency to cover protests from a lens is that a kind of a framing that that marginalizes and diminishes the protesters, that talks about them as if they were wild, threatening, unknown, that focuses on the sensational aspects of the protest rather than on the process or the genuine concerns of the individuals protesting. So, in this study, the authors found that Global Voices content was significantly more focused on the voices and the perspectives of individuals in protests, that the articles tended to legitimize those voices, explain those voices, that mainstream media was much more focused on, the New York Times was much more focused on reporting authoritative voices rather than on the protest voices, that they tended to frame the issue in languages of sensation and conflict rather than process, and that that Global Voices cut significantly against the grain or the concept as presented by that protest paradigm. So it's a really interesting study. If anybody wants to look at the data, it's available. I can share the URL with you. GV is a work in progress. It's one part a large community of social activists and writers and translators, one part research experiment, and one part, and I think this is also a really important point, one part community of people who really like to work together. And when we talk about issues of locality and distance and humanization and participation, one thing for me always stands out about this community, which is that people affiliate and understand other parts of the world when they know somebody who has, or when they develop a personal relationship to it. So the concept of framing that we have of international news, which is very equivalent to foreign news, something that's further away is more sensational, the story has to be larger, the story has to be more conflictual, the further away you get from the source, or the old saw, all news is local. I think that's true. All news really is local, but local no longer has to mean geographically proximate. And for me, the Global Voices community is entirely local, even when those people speak languages other than mine or live in another part of the world, because we are able to create another kind of locality. And when something happens in Haiti and I have a friend that I know who has a relationship with Haiti, I care about that issue. And so it becomes a local issue for me. It becomes a personal issue for me, in a sense. And so of the many things that the internet gives us, it does give us that capacity. I want to agree with you, though, that just because we have built an internet that gives us that potential, it doesn't mean we have it. We still have to be incredibly intentional about making the conversations that we want. And in a way, just because we have that potential, it almost seems as if people have said, okay, we no longer need to deal with the issue. We no longer need to focus on the question of whether or not we have access to voice, because we've solved it as a structural point of view. But that is not the case. We need to be always intentional in terms of how we build and organize communities. For me, the key there is actually about storytelling. Voice as a concept is incredibly important, but voice doesn't necessarily encourage people to read or engage. Right? Just because you say, look, you need to go listen to those people, you need to hear what they say, it doesn't mean that everybody will. You might get a certain super user community who really does care about that concept, but if you're trying to broaden your audience, you still have to tell good stories. You still have to be engaging, you still have to tell, you still have to discuss, you have to build a conversational platform. And it's a constant experiment in how to do that, but it starts with people who are building empathy and figuring out how to talk to each other across barriers and borders. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Can you do my slides for me? Okay, great. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah, I'm on. Oh, that was like magic. Hi. So let me know when you have the first one on. So, hi, I'm Katie Orenstein. I'm an author, journalist, folklorist, and maybe give you the first slide. This is a question that I've been interested in for a long time, for 20 years actually. I studied folklore in college, and I went to Haiti to go and study folklore in Haiti, and while I was there, a coup broke out. So I began to report on what was going on the streets and became a journalist. And for many years, a question plagued me because people would ask me all the time, how can you be both of these things? How could you be a folklorist? How could you be a journalist? Aren't they the opposite? And I think, does anyone else have this question in your mind? I think it's a question that a lot of people have, that the distinction that many of us make is between fact and fiction, between journalism and folklore, between history and storytelling. And I think that's a common distinction for many of us, and I think it's not a very useful one. Because when you look at what goes down in history, the salient factor is seldom what's fact and what's fiction. It's almost always who tells the story. And I want to share really quickly, and mainly because you mentioned it, Ivan, the first piece that I ever wrote, which is just over 20 years ago now. And I wrote it because there was a protest. It was a protest story. There was a protest against the New York Times, by Haitians, in fact. 100,000 Haitians marched across the Brooklyn Bridge. This was in the early 1990s. And they accused the New York Times of being the voice of the State Department. It was widely reported. It was widely reported in all the news, but no one bothered to check if they were right. And I thought, well, how would we know? Maybe we should look into it. I didn't actually have access to internet then. Very few of us did, unless you were using Mosaic. So I thought I would just buy the New York Times and count their sources, which I did for several weeks. And guess what I found out? In my first published piece, actually, so you can all check this for yourself. More or less 40% of the sources that were cited in the New York Times were US diplomats, and another 40% were foreign diplomats or heads of NGOs, which left 20%, roughly more or less, because I'm doing this on the fly, so you can fact check me in my own piece, but that left about 20% of the sources that cited were Haitian. And I thought, in fact, they had a point. They had a great point, and in fact, it turned out that the facts that were reported by those sources were very different from the facts that were reported by the Haitian sources. And it gave me a very good starting point as my career began as a journalist folklorist into that question, which I think is maybe the most salient question of history. Who tells the story? Gave me a really good window into that question and why it matters. So I want to flash forward for quite a while, 20 years in fact. I founded an organization that we addressed this question. And it started about 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, because a big debate broke out. So I'm a journalist. I write about all kinds of things. I wrote about Haiti. I write about women. I write about media. And I never thought I would start an organization. But 5 or 6 years ago, a big debate broke out. It's a little, actually more like 7 now, about why there are so few voices in the world. And why there are so few women's voices. And it started when Larry Summers, then president of Harvard University, gave a very controversial speech, and he wondered why there are so few women in higher math and science. Does everyone remember this? Could it be he asked a question of biological aptitude? And that pissed a lot of people off and sparked a lot of parallel debates. And one of them was a debate about the media, and particularly about opinion forums. Why are there so few women? A very prominent syndicated columnist in Los Angeles, Susan Estrich, actually she's a nationally syndicated columnist, but she sparked a very public fight with the then editor Michael Kinsley of the Los Angeles Times. She accused the institution of sexism. And then it reverberated everywhere, nationally, internationally. Every media outlet that I read or have ever read weighed in. And it went something like this. Susan Estrich accused Michael Kinsley of sexism, then Maureen Dowd weighed in at the New York Times. She was then the only female columnist there, and she said, it's not sexism, it's socialization. Women don't submit pieces, we don't write pieces because we are afraid of being attacked. And then she wrote, we're also afraid of being called bitches. By the way, the New York Times prints that word, so I feel it's my duty to say it. I do. And then Anne Applebaum at the Washington Post weighed in, And she took offense at being called a woman journalist. She was then the only female columnist there. And she said, why do I need to waste a column on my female status? I'm a thinking human being. I'm paraphrasing. More or less, I'm a thinking human being. That's all that matters. Why do I need to waste a column on this? And it went around and around like that. Biology, socialization, sexism, does it really matter? Around and around. And I watched that with a lot of interest, partly because I'm a woman journalist and partly because I'm really concerned with this question, but partly because I had written for a lot of these outlets and I knew there was a more obvious problem, a much more solvable problem, a mechanical problem, which is that women don't submit with anywhere near the frequency that men do. And in fact, I want to just show you some slides to give you a sense of how we got where we are. This is going to sort of take us through what I've just said, but if you could give me the next slide. This is the problem that we address. Most of the voices we hear come from a narrow slice of society. And next slide, which looks kind of like this. Does anyone know where I got this slide from? Yes, it's from the movie Being John Malkovich. And there's actually a scene in the movie that I love. Does anyone remember that in the movie, this is the plot, there's a portal. And if you go through the portal, you become John Malkovich. But then in the movie, John Malkovich goes through the John Malkovich portal. Does anyone remember this? And he emerges on the other side and everyone is John Malkovich. And he's in a restaurant and the waiters are John Malkovich. And the lounge singer in her sexy dress has got a big John Malkovich head. And the baby crying at the next table is John Malkovich. And the menu says Malkovich, 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 Malkovich. That's the only thing anyone can say. And it occurs to me that, you know, I love John Malkovich. He's one of my favorite actors. But if Malkovich is the only thing on the menu, that's a pretty bad menu. I also want to take a moment to say that I think that actually Malkovich models a bit of the solution. We should all be a little bit more visible and more powerful. So I'm saying that with respect. But there's the visual. And there's a question that it prompts, which is, next slide. What is the cost of so many missing voices and so many missing minds and so many missing ideas and so much missing brain power? And next slide. What if we could invest in it? And here's a slide of a starting point. Next slide. This is a starting point, and actually, this is an old slide which I'm about to replace because people tend to forget that things change. We tend to think that we're stuck, but actually lots of things change. Next slide. And there are two very obvious changes here. Congress has changed, and opinion forums have changed. In the 5 years that we've been around, there's been a 6 percentage point increase in women on opinion pages, which is actually a 40% improvement for women. And so the reason I put 2 slides there instead of 1 is just to remind us to get out of the complacency and the inertia of, hey, it's always been this way. You know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But actually, it's not true. Things do change. We're actually working on a problem that's changing right beneath our noses. This is an important starting point, though, because we're actually the slight majority of the population and a very tiny minority of voice. 16.5% right now. And next slide. And now we're caught up to the question, why so few, that I raised before. And this is sort of the circular debate that's been going on forever and ever, which I summarized for you a minute ago. Biology, sexism, socialization. And next slide. What if there was a much simpler answer? And this is just a visualization of what I mentioned a moment ago, submission ratios to key opinion forums. As a result of this big debate that took place a little over 5 years ago, the Washington Post decided to track their opinion forum. They decided to track submissions. And during a 5-month period, they found that 9 out of 10 submissions came from men. 9 out of 10 to that enormously influential outlet came from men. And lo and behold, their publication ratio, I'm not really sure why this is slid down there, was roughly 9 out of 10. 90%, 88%, it's almost exactly the same. Submissions were very accurately predicting publication. And so it occurred to me as I looked at this data, and I knew the data from the other publications where I wrote for were quite similar, it occurred to me, you know, could be biology, could be sexism, could be the weather. How the hell would we know? How the hell would we know if we were not submitting? You can't win a game if you're not playing it. And in this case, submissions were predicting publication more surely than high school was predicting college. So the obvious solution, to me it seemed, was to increase the number of smart women submitting to these forums. Next slide. I also want to take a moment to talk about why this matters, because I'm not so interested in these forums as the end of the conversation. In fact, I'm hardly interested in them for that reason at all. I'm interested in them because they are very often the beginning of the conversation. They are the beginning of the public conversation, the front door into the marketplace of ideas. Next slide, which looks sort of like this. And maybe some of you have participated in it already. Has anyone here written an op-ed? Can you raise your hand? Has anyone spoken on the radio? Has anyone been on television? Got a major grant? Received a fellowship? Are these things related? In your experience, if these things in your experience are related, raise your hand. Somewhat? Yes? So this is, I want to just point out to you, this is a visualization of how influence accrues. So it starts with an idea, right? It often starts with an idea. It might be an op-ed or another front door idea forum, wherever you can get the seed of an idea out there into the world. If you're only sharing it at your kitchen table, it doesn't have a chance to establish itself, to get traction and to grow. And if your idea is good, it will be shared. It may be shared via social media, by blog mentions, by expert citations. Yahoo did a study a couple of years ago, just not even quite 2 years ago. It was called the Like Log Study. And they decided to track what was most shared, what was most liked in social media. It's not cats, I'm sorry to tell you. Well, how ideas spread, not images. I really can't speak to the cat. I can, has, whatever the cat's language is. It's commentary. It's commentary. The month of the study, the most shared idea / article was the Tiger Mom story. It was the Tiger Mom opinion piece. Expert citations, and all of these things increase your credibility. And when you increase your credibility, the next things happen. Radio, TV appearances, maybe book deals, speaking opportunities, exposure. On our advisory board sits one of the senior bookers for CNN. And there are 3 ways that she and her colleagues decide who's going to go on TV every morning. The first thing they do is they check the opinion forums. The second thing they do is they check social media, which are largely running things that are appearing in the opinion forums. And the third thing they do is they check their Rolodexes, which are stacked by the first 2 things. Those are the 3 main ways, not the only, but the 3 main ways they determine who goes on TV. By the way, all of these things, I'm sharing with you not only something that's a generic diagram, but a diagram that also mirrors my own personal experience. And then on the far right, we have influence, funding, fellowships, policy consulting invitations, leadership positions. What we have essentially on the far right is thought leadership across every field, whether it's academia, politics, business, media. Very hard forums to get into. Very hard. What I mean is it's very hard to wake up and successfully run for Congress if you have not already made a name for yourself. But on the far left side here, we have early, easy access forums. Forums that you could wake up and enter if you have a good idea, maybe a few credentials, something to say. And it's often where it starts. That's why this is so important, and that's why it occurred to me that these forums, these key thought leadership opinion forums, matter. They matter because they predict what's happening on the right. Next slide. And I just wanted to insert a slide about myself because this is actually, I received a fellowship to start this project, the OpEd project, and they ask us why you do what you do. They go through a process. Why did you get this idea? Why do you do what you do? This was my long-winded answer then, but it occurred to me that it's the same answer to the same question that I've been circling around for 20 years. Because there are stories that we tell, and I'm very interested in the outcomes of those stories, and I'm interested not only in the stories that we hear, but in the minority report. Whether that report comes from Haitians protesting, or whether that report comes from women, or from some other underrepresented group. Next slide. I wanted to just give you, we do a lot of data on how things are changing, and I wanted to share with you because there's so much bad news and there's so much confusion about what's happening in this dramatically shifting landscape. And I wanted to share with you a few data points that came out of every year we do a study. We're in the process of doing this year's study, so this is from last year. And first of all, this is a look at percentage op-eds written by women in the last 6 years. You can see these are traditional or legacy media, and you can see that there's a pretty significant improvement, a very significant improvement. If you looked across, we track an index of thought leadership forums, not just these three. And as I mentioned before, there's been a 6 percentage point improvement over the last 5 or 6 years. Next slide. So the first thing to keep in mind is that there's a big increase for women. The second thing to keep in mind, because people ask a lot, what's happening in new media? What's happening across age ranges? We decided to track new media, traditional media, and college outlets, just to track what's happening as a curiosity point. So the first and most obvious thing is that new media are doing much better, if you look at gender, than traditional or legacy media. And colleges are doing the best of all. So there's something that happens when men and women graduate from college. I think it's not a big surprise, but it's really interesting to see it there, in numbers and with real data. There's a real drop-off point. In fact, when we got this data, we decided that we would start working younger, and we've launched our first 2 major high school projects this year. So this is actually some interesting news, some good news, some interesting news. We're shifting into new media, and there's this big increase, but there's also a caveat, and it's this. Next slide. Actually, this is a look at, sorry, we're going to do one more slide, but this is quickly, if you go back, we'll give people a chance. This is just a look at some of the outlets that we surveyed this is just over, this is a slice, one data point. We survey them over 3 months every year. And next. And the real question is, what are we writing about? So as we move online, one of the things that's happening is we are also siloing ourselves, and gender is a really interesting way to look at this. So this is, we decided, we haven't labeled them as such here, but we decided that we would flag what we considered pink topic matter, and we defined pink by what was traditionally called the 4 F's in journalism, and we added a 5th actually: food, fashion, furniture, and family, and we added feminism. Those are what, if you were, in the days of Brenda Starr or Lois Lane, those are the topics that you were probably assigned to write about in the women's section of the newspaper. Journalism was one of the first sort of male-dominated careers that women got into, and yet they were typically siloed into those topic matter. And you can see this is what, this is women, this is men, yellow is men, and you can see that we are still doing that. The top 4 entries here are family, gender, style, food. And if you look down here at the economy, of roughly, I think that the total number of articles on the economy that were surveyed was just under 1,000, 11% were written by women. I want to make clear that we don't think that the 4 F's are any less valid than all the other topic matter. We were just interested in who's writing about everything else. And we do think it's a problem when 11% of the articles about the economy, only 11% are written by women. We think the economy is a women's issue too. Next slide, maybe that's the last slide. Yeah, that's the last slide. I just wanted to take a moment. I think these are important data points. First, because when we released that, there was a huge amount of media coverage of that. And the media coverage was almost exclusively, glaringly negative. Not about us, but about the data. Isn't it horrible? Women write about pink topic matter. When that's actually a sliver of our data. And so I want to take a moment to emphasize that actually there's some really good news in that. That actually, number one, there's an increase, a shift towards more gender parity and better representation. And second of all, that as we move online, there's also more women online, more voices, more women's voices. And that the caveat we shouldn't throw the good news out with that caveat. The caveat is that we tend to silo ourselves. I want to say that that's an interesting piece of data to consider, not just for gender, but for everything. Because I believe it's happening everywhere. The more we go online, the more power we have to choose our audiences, choose our news, choose our opinions. And you know that famous saying, you have the right to your opinions, but not the right to your own facts? That's completely false. That's completely false now. People are choosing their own quote-unquote facts. I think this idea that facts are objective is a really interesting paradox, because what the salient factor, back to how history gets made, is not what's true or what's false, but what we choose to notice. What we choose to notice, what we choose to draw attention to, where we drive resources and where we drive talent, where we drive attention. This is what's the salient factor. The scarce commodity in a world where anyone can have a voice is our attention. Where is it going to go? And in fact, people are choosing their own news, their own opinions, their own audiences, their own facts. And I think that's something that's not just true about gender. I think it's something that we can examine for all of, what are the implications of that for all of us? How much time do I have? 1 minute? Then why don't I take a moment to say, really quickly, I think that there are important structural and cultural forces that we're all talking about, all of us. But I also think that there are things we can do that have to do with direct behavioral change. And that's an area where we choose to focus. So the work of the OpEd project, and hence the name, we've decided that we are going to look at those big questions, sexism, socialization, biology, the weather, and just respond, you know what, who cares? Not who cares like it doesn't matter, but who cares in the sense that let's focus on our attention on changing the numbers. What could we do to change the numbers? What could we do, for example, if we could change the numbers in a highly leveraged, focused, strategic, smart way? Certain key opinion forums, the index that we track, they shape agendas in a big way, big global, international, and national agendas as well as local. And we've seen that submission ratios predict publication ratios in these forums. And that publications in these forums predicts further off on that chart that I put up there, thought leadership in much bigger ways. So what if we could change the numbers in this highly leveraged way? What would it take? What would it take to increase the numbers, for example, in a very realistic way, from 15%, which was where we started as women 5 years ago, to 30%, where some research says a tipping point happens. Now we're at 21%. We've actually done back of the envelope math so we know what more or less the numbers would be. It would require 15,000 additional women submitting to these forums every year, or one woman submitting 15,000 times. I always like to say that. That's not something I could do or my team could do, but it is something that we could do together through all of you, potentially through all of you. So this is what we're doing. We're running programs all around the nation. We run them in 9 major cities open to the public, and we're currently running intensive fellowship programs at major universities across the country. We run a short one here, and we run year-long programs at Northwestern, Yale, Dartmouth, 10 others. And the goal of these programs is to create a behavioral change that will shift the numbers. Not because we think the numbers are everything, but because we think they're a way in. Not because they're the end of the conversation, but because we think they're the beginning of the conversation. And to be super clear, what is that conversation? The conversation is not about op-eds or op-ed pages. It's essentially a conversation about history and citizenship. Because I believe, and you tell me if you do too, but I believe that you and I and we have not only a right, but also a responsibility to shape history through our voices and the voices we lift up.
Thanks, everybody. That was fantastic. We have a few minutes for questions, and then I hope everyone will come upstairs to our reception and keep this conversation going. I like to ask the first question because that's the privilege you get when you organize these things. So a theme that was important for all of you was the importance of commentary, which is something that as a journalist and as journalism students, we don't always get trained in. We don't always think about. We think a lot about how to be objective, but we don't think about how to write an argument or how to inject our own point of view. So I'm really interested for all of you, and Catherine talked about how op-ed pages can be a place for counterframes, and Ivan talked about how Global Voices really changes the voices we hear from in a protest situation, and of course Katie just told us how it changes thought leadership. But I want to know more about what commentary is these days. I mean, is it an op-ed? Is that the way, do I have to write an op-ed for the New York Times to be influential? Can I put up my blog and will anyone pay attention? What, I know this is a long question, but how do you make a difference with your commentary?
I feel like I'm talking.
You want to take a break? Somebody else can go.
I'll just answer really quickly. I think we are living in a world where it's increasingly important, and the division between news and commentary is blurring more and more every day. And also, we live in a world where anyone with an internet connection can have a voice. It doesn't mean that voice will be heard or is necessarily any good, but it does mean that we benefit, all of us, if we can somehow share broadly, quickly, the tools of really good commentary, not just noise, not just Sturm und Drang, but what does it mean to have an evidence-based argument that is timely and of public value?
Ivan.
A slightly different focus, which is really about conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that in social media contexts, we see that people who have persistence and wit and a way of building networks that really understand the social media tools that we have, whether it's blogs or whether it's microblogging or posting images, that those people can, regardless of where they come from, are able to build significant networks and influence. And I can think of many examples of people who are coming from places all over the world who have, just by virtue of their brains and their cleverness, have been able to build real influence in those entirely non-institutional networks.
That's interesting because as journalism students, we learn a lot about persistence, but we don't learn that much about wit. I don't know if it's something you can learn, but we'll try.
Well, you're actively discouraged from having one.
Exactly right. Can you say more about
against
that?
objectivity, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why I really like going away from this impartiality idea, which is part of history, right? It's a historical formation of a way of thinking about the world and judging the world that is artificial and is impossible, I would argue, right? And so I think that idea of objectivity as an interaction between different voices so that you can truly consider different experiences and viewpoints, that transformativeness is better done through the art versus the science of journalism. And so I think that's part of the reason why people are so excited about the internet, is that they can experiment with that. And also, if you just think about some of the journalists that we venerate in journalism history, they're the literary journalists, Joan Didion and people like that. I mean, people are usually not lauded for just getting the facts. They're lauded for...
don't say that. We have journalism students
I know
here.
we do.
No.
But,
Totally
people remember, have you no decency? I mean, people remember these sorts of moments. So, if you think about that connection that Ivan was talking about, people need to feel a connection to a story. And if we are trying to include more people in a conversation, trying to make that connection can help. I'm not saying you should be dishonest in order to make that connection, but that's something people need.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I love the idea of the transformative conversation. I'm a little less comfortable with the idea of everyone having their own facts, though. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Well, really what I'm talking about is the selection process. In one of the things that we do in all the programs that we run is we ask people what they think an evidence-based, value-driven argument is, and we get all kinds of answers. What does that mean? What does value mean? What does evidence mean? And eventually you'll get the scientists in the room who say, we dig up our evidence and then we shape our values based on that. And then somebody else in the room will say the exact opposite. I let my values determine where my research will go. And then it becomes clear that actually it's a dance that's completely inseparable. And that's really what I mean by that.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I should let other people ask questions. Yeah.
Absolutely.
This is particularly for Ivan, because he's been analyzing things so thoroughly. Has there been any reaction on the Open Voices Forum to underneath the television news and all that sort of stuff is coming out of the international community?
We've been talking about it, but we haven't, at least, I mean, I haven't had time to spend a lot of time on the site today because I've been traveling, but for a big US story like that, we tend actually not to talk so much about it because it's being covered so thoroughly by US media. So we might pick up on this story from the perspective of international reactions to the Boston story, or something about the comparative, I mean, behind the scenes, we're not necessarily talking about this on the site right now, but there's certainly a lot of chatter about what else happened on that day that was of equivalent impact in other countries. So the fact that, you know, more people were killed on that day yesterday in car bombings in Iraq, or the number of people killed in protests in Peshawar on that day by a bombing that also happened on that day, and the equivalent media attention that those different stories get, and why it is that a story that, I mean, for me, it's a really fascinating thing to say, why is it that a story that occurs to, something that occurs to a US citizen has so much more impact globally than something that occurs to a Pakistani citizen? Not to say, and never to say, that one has, you know, one should diminish the value of either, but just that systematically and structurally that is what happens by global, in terms of global media. And it's a really interesting, I mean, just, it's hard to talk about this kind of analytic level so close to an event, so I want to be very careful about this. But thinking about the way that this particular act of terror functions on the American psyche, it's a terribly effective event because it struck individuals who are almost naked, frankly, right? You know, individuals who are running, who are in a sporting event, and individuals who look just like everybody else around them, who are not in a conflict zone. And there's a whole conversation we could have about images and violence and death, and who gets depicted in war zones, and whose body gets depicted, whose body is blown up, and whose is not. And just a really simple snapshot, a fact for you on this is that during the Iraq War, I think the American publications published, I think 6, and I could fact check this, but I think 6 images of American soldiers dead versus hundreds and hundreds of Iraqi dead published on American press. So there's once we get a little bit of distance from this topic, there's a huge amount of kind of consideration about it from a media studies perspective, from a communications perspective. And again, meaning absolutely no disrespect to anybody because it's obviously a terrible event.
You know, this actually reminds me of a quick question I wanted to ask, which I'm curious about the bombings. I want to know how you first heard about it. If you heard it, can I raise your hand if you first heard about it on Twitter, Facebook, social media, or some alternative medium, email? And raise your hand if you first heard it on mainstream media. Okay, so that was about half and half. How many, with the 9/11 bombings, who first heard about that in mainstream media? And social media or internet?
Was there any?
No, so that's a huge change. That's a really interesting, huge change. Half of you.
There was none. It was just blogging. Yeah, I mean, there was just,
Yeah.
there wasn't really a little bit.
That's really
nascent
an
blogging.
interesting trend. But let's take some more questions. Yeah, Janine.
My name is Janine Zakaria. I was the Washington Post Jerusalem bureau chief in Cairo during the revolution, so I come at your commentary there from a certain perspective. I also teach, I've written my whole career on foreign affairs, so perhaps I'm the exception to that statistic where it was about 9%. I write commentary. I don't even like the word commentary. Katie, you and I can talk about that later. I like to call it reported analysis or something like that. I don't like people who just have opinions. So I'm a little bit like having a heart attack over here about this notion that we need to be more opinion-oriented somehow in the reporting, especially in what I'm calling the era of noise right now, when there is this blurring. And so for me, the distinction is quite holy. I also teach COM 104 here, which is reporting, writing, and understanding the news. And last quarter, out of the 11 students I taught, 10 were women. And any other quarter where it's a bit more mixed, if I took the names off, I would see no distinction in terms of the kind of stories they're picking or the kind of way that they write it. So I'm interested more in this whole gender question. I'm not arguing in an Ann Applebaum way that it's not valued, but I want to just pursue that a little further. But what I really want to ask the panel is, given that this was more of a critique of mainstream media, to me, I'm concerned that there is no more main source of news for the country. That people are going to these different places. And even in its form where perhaps they don't nail the subprime mortgage crisis, or maybe it's something more pernicious, as Catherine was saying, that they really do a disservice in the way it's reported. Is there some value, in your opinion, of having a main newscast and a main newspaper that the whole country can read so that they all get a certain set of facts, information, and opinion? Or are we better off seeing it go away?
I'll answer that first, if that's okay.
Thank you.
I'm old school. I think that there should be more overlap in our conversation, right? So I think that I think people should trust, and there is a lot of distrust that is born from a lot of exclusion that has been happening, since the printing press, right? So I think part of the problem is that people can so easily disperse to different sources. And I think that there has to be some sort of soul searching amongst those flagship institutions like the New York Times and the Post and CNN and all these other places to ask themselves why people aren't coming back to brands that used to be trusted. Of course, the technological changes are part of it, but that's not all that, right? Because some online ventures have failed. It's not just if you build it, they will come. And we also know that people still recirculate a lot of the traditional or prestigious media online. So if you're going online and you're looking at somebody's blog, they're usually taking off from some other source, right? So I think there is a value for having some sort of centralization, for people to have a shared space and a shared source, and we're not all going to become citizen journalists, right? I mean, the Global Voices journalists are doing a great job, but not all of us are going to do that. So I share your concern. I specifically share your concern when I hear from my students saying the wackiest stuff I've ever heard, and where they got it from, I don't know, but it is troubling to me that we seem to be losing some ways of having shared resources and shared conversation in the broader sense. So I'm not arguing against that. I think I'm arguing against the lethargy of making those premier spaces that do have the reach more inclusive. People have fallen down on the job. They made a lot of promises in the 70s and the 80s, and they did not fulfill them. And that's part of the distrust of news media. That's a big part of it, I think.
Ivan, you have a thought?
So first I want to say that once we can argue or talk about what a fact is or what truth is, but at the heart of our endeavor and the Global Voices endeavor is actually an interest in what facts are. It's more about finding those sources or origins of fact that are not necessarily covered. And that's the reason that we exist as an organization. So not to split hairs, but I think that that's actually really important. And I think that there are a lot of people in the citizen media space who are really interested in facts and truth. The distinction I make in our context is not between professionals versus amateurs, but between people who are working in a journalistic context or an information context that is commercial or civic, towards what or some other end. What is your motivation for participation? In our context, the incentive is always about civic information towards some kind of civic end. And that's the distinction that we make. When I talk about citizen journalism, I'm not talking about somebody who is a rank amateur who's happening to produce something. I'm talking about their motivations for participation, which brings me to my next point. I think that the golden era of American journalism was a technological blip based on a regulatory policy of about 25 years, but based on a regulatory policy that created a very explicit set of access to television and channeled through near monopolies advertising money to newspapers and television stations. That was partly regulatory and partly technological. Those technologies have changed, and we have to move on in a different way. There's a very simple answer if we as a country want to have a common language and a common voice, and that is to separate the commercial from the civic. If we care enough about that, then we'll pay for it. We'll pay for it through a range of private issues, or we'll create public media that we actually can have to serve us in the way that the CBC does, or the way that the BBC does, or many other countries that have public media. And we'll live with that and we'll be happy. And I think that the American journalistic system has this mindset in which journalistic entrepreneurial behavior is embedded somehow in the private sector. But I'm not convinced that public support for journalistic behavior can't coexist with public funding and real journalism. In fact, I've seen it happen, and I think it can. But we have something about some kind of odd mind block about that function here in this country. Be interested to hear what others think about it.
Can I just really quickly, I think there's three important things to keep in mind with traditional media or having some sort of main thing, even as it's changing. The first is I think that there's certain kinds of information that costs money. Investigative journalism, that foreign bureaus, it costs money. It costs money to do if you're going to do it in an independent, or at least idealistically, hopefully objective way. And second of all, there's because we would like to imagine that we would have media that comes with a set of practices, learning, standards, training. That's another thing that we get from legacy media. And the third, which is something that everyone's talking about, is this idea of the public square. We're actually having the public conversation, if not at the exact same time, at least in the same sort of time zone. Because what does it mean when people are having completely different conversations over, long periods of time? It makes me wonder what happens when the conversation is spread out so far, so thin, and over such a long period of time. Do we have the same opportunity for meaningful interaction?
Great. Well, that is all the questions we have time for here. But I invite all of you to come upstairs with us, have a snack, have a drink, and keep the conversation going. But thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to our speakers.